I know you're out there. I know that you're afraid. You're afraid of us. You're afraid of change. I don't know the future. I didn't come here to tell you how this is going to end. I came here to tell you how it's going to begin. I'm going to hang up this phone, and then I'm going to show these people what you don't want them to see. A world without rules and controls, without borders or boundaries. A world where anything is possible. Where we go from there is a choice I leave to you.
The KrisAnne Hall Show.
Any varmint that crosses that lady's path has met its match. Come on!
Rise and shine, liberty-loving patriots. Welcome to the KrisAnne Hall Show. KrisAnne Hall here, KrisAnnehall.com. So happy to be here with you today. So honored to be able to bring you liberty over security, principle over party, and truth over our favorite personalities. And while we are distracted by the insanity of our upcoming presidential election, I think that we need to refocus on Congress and see what's really going on. Refocus on what the federal government is doing and the things that it shouldn't be doing. It's amazing because I just spoke at a conference in Grass Valley, California, and I was not the only speaker, and I got to hear the other speakers, which I don't often get to do. And my friend Debbie Bacigalupe was speaking on Agenda 21. By the way, if you need to know about Agenda 21 or Common Core, Debbie Bacigalupe is the one that I think that you need to talk to, especially about Agenda 21. She is my go-to expert on Agenda 21. She has made several films with large conservative groups regarding Agenda 21 and regarding this issue of the federal government populating our national forests with wolves. Not reintroducing them because they were never there. But there's this crazy movement in the federal government about putting wolves on our federal land, and they are absolutely decimating everything. You know what's crazy is about these wolves. Again, they're not supposed to be there. And we put clips and necklaces around every single wolf that we release. And I say we because we're paying for that. And then to track these things. And these wolves are predators. Now, of course they're predators, but they're predators in a very unique sense. They kill and then leave their prey to die. They don't eat them. They just kill to kill. Debbie shows pictures about her treks through these national forests and onto ranchers' lands, because, you know, we now have this crossover between federal land and private land. The federal government has seized up so much land that it's now creating these massive easements into ranchers' land. You remember Cliven Bundy, what happened with him in this federal theft of all of this land is just crazy. And I don't think we realize how this works. So these ranchers have been on this land for generations. And then the Bureau of Land Management comes in and says, if you give us an easement on your land, we will help you manage your land. All you have to do, farmers and ranchers, is collectively pay a fee to the Bureau of Land Management to help us develop funding and develop research and R&D and plans on how we can help you better manage your land if you give us an easement. Well, that was a long time ago. And now the easement that the farmers and the ranchers gave the federal government has flip-flopped. Now the federal government has claimed ownership of this land, and allowed the farmers and ranchers easement on federal land. I'll remind you that the federal government has no authority to own these lands. There is no constitutional authority for federal government to own any land whatsoever beyond 10 square miles for the capital of the United States, and any land necessary to maintain forts and ports and their buildings. Now, federal land that goes beyond that scope. By the way, the forts and ports provision has a subclause that says it must be maintained as long as they have the permission of the states. So when the states want to get rid of the forts and the ports, all they have to do is serve the federal government eviction notice and the land goes back to the states. Isn't that crazy? All these national forests and all these federal lands are completely and totally unconstitutional. And if you want to follow the Constitution and simply say that these federal lands are an expansion of that forts and ports clause, then all you have to do is simply say, as a state, we no longer want you here, and we're going to issue an eviction notice. And so now we have farmers and ranchers who are on their land, now called federal land, and now the federal government is introducing these wolves into this federal land, and it's decimating livestock. These wolves don't just kill to eat food. They kill hundreds of sheep and just leave them there, just to kill them. And I've seen the pictures, I've seen the facts, and it's the truth. And now we're seeing stories about, Debbie has these pictures of communities who have built wolf cages. Wolf cages, not for wolves, but for their children. So when the children have to wait for the school bus, they have to step inside these wolf cages. Because guess what? If they don't, their children could be attacked by these wolves. Debbie says it's just crazy how the federal government worships the creation more than the creator, and that the people, that these wolves have more rights than the people who own the land and live on it. Why? Because we're completely out of control with the federal government. Completely out of control. And we need to take a look at what our federal government is doing. There is a case that's coming up before the Ninth Circus. We always call the Ninth Circuit of Appeals the Ninth Circus because they have absolutely no consideration for law, for the Constitution, or for any amount of reason and logic whatsoever. So there's no telling what's going to happen. Well, I'll tell you what's going to happen with this case now that it's in the Ninth Circus. But nonetheless, apparently, there is a Knights of Columbus statue on a private resort. And the Knights of Columbus statue is a statue of Jesus wearing a ski helmet. Now, it is a private resort. It is a permanent Catholic shrine on a private resort. It's called the Big Mountain Resort. The statue has been on Big Mountain Resort since 1954. And here's the controversy. This private resort is located on federal land. No, I can't tell you how that happens. How does a private resort end up on federal land? Or more appropriately, how does the federal government happen to own land upon which a private resort exists? But so here's the controversy, right? You have a private resort on federal land, and now the Freedom from Religion Foundation is claiming that this permanent Catholic shrine is on public land, which is prohibited by the Establishment Clause. Just like a Catholic church could not be on public land. Separation of church and state, they claim. Well, the 800-pound gorilla in the room here is this. How about separation of federal government from land ownership? So they're going to get into this big mess about whether this statue on a private resort, which has been on public land, should be there, right? So which is the whole issue is going to be which land ownership trumps which, right? Because you have a private resort, but the land is owned by the federal government. And so the question will be in the courts, which land ownership trumps which. This is really a huge case. This is a case bigger than a shrine of Jesus wearing a ski helmet. This is going to be a case that's going to set a precedent about land ownership. And we need to be looking at this. Because the question will be, whose land ownership trumps whom? Does the federal land, the fact that it's federal land, this big, huge national forests, trump the fact that it's got a piece of private resort sitting on top of it? The Forest Service land was leased to the Knights of Columbus by a private resort. You can't follow these facts because they make not a stinking bit of sense. How does the Forest Service lease land to the Knights of Columbus by a private resort? This is what happens when the federal government leaps outside its limited defined box and defies the Constitution, because it makes no sense. And now we have the federal government and the Forest Service trumping the Constitution, and they're going to create two big decisions in one. Two birds with one stone. Ending this exhibit of freedom of speech and private ownership of land in one fell swoop.
KrisAnne Hall Show. She's Liberty's lobbyist.
So I ask you, America, as we are consumed by this upcoming presidential election, and we are enamored by the brazen loudmouth of Donald Trump, we are still focused on the wrong issues. All this stuff, all these things are distractions. Absolute, complete, and total distractions. You love the way Donald Trump speaks. What is his foreign policy? What is his stance on gun ownership? What is his stance on federal land? What is his stance on the federal government involving themselves in education and the maintenance of the Department of Transportation and all of these other things? These are what I want to know. These are the questions that we should be asking, because right now we have an issue that's ignoring the real issue of federal land ownership, and is going to create an issue where we are going to end the ownership of any property on these federal lands and the ability to engage in freedom of religion. I want you to think about the magnitude of this. Think about how many businesses exist on federal land right now. I don't think we realize this. How much federal land the federal government possesses. They can't own it. They possess it through extortion and through lies and through theft. But nonetheless, this is the world that we live in today. We don't have a Congress that's willing to stand up for the Constitution and end federal land, because they could. Our Congress, our conservative Congress, in their simple majority, could end the ownership of the federal government's land ownership right now. They could do that by simply defunding federal land ownership and reverting all that land ownership back to the states. And then the states can allow the people of their states to own their land. But you need to take a look at this and see how many businesses, how many homes, how many ranchers and farmers exist on federal land right now, because this case is huge. This case is going to be a decision that will determine whether people who own homes on their land that exist in federal property will be able to have religious statues on their homes. Why? Because it's private land that exists on federal property. Will they be able to have freedom of their own expressions? Well, if they don't own a statue on their land, is it possible that they don't own a home on their land? Is it possible that the ranchers don't own their livestock on their land? Is it possible that the farmers don't own their crops on their land? I want you to see how big this case really is, because this is about property ownership and about the federal government seizing property from private people. I don't think that we understand the real issues here. James Madison tells us in his dissertation on property, says the government is instituted to protect property of every sort, and that we have property rights within our individuals. That's where property rights exist, within the individuals, not within government, because government is existed to protect our property. He says this is not a just government, nor is property secure under it, where the property which a man has in his personal safety and his personal liberty is violated by arbitrary seizures of one class of citizen for the service of a rest. He calls this complete despotism, when the federal government is able to engage what he calls in arbitrary restrictions, exemptions, and monopolies to deny part of its citizens that free use of their faculties and free choice of their occupations. He says this is not a just government. And that's exactly what is happening in this federal land issue. The federal government is stealing our property. And we're fulfilling the warnings of James Madison like a prophecy.
So don't let them steal your light. Don't let them break your stride. There is light on the other side. You'll see all the raindrops falling me. It's a revolution.
The KrisAnne Hall Show. She's Liberty's lobbyist.
So the Ninth Circus is going to be left to decide this very, very important case. Not a single whisper or mumble from Congress over this. Of course not. They're still too busy worrying about Confederate flags and funding education and funding the maintenance of our roads. I want to share with you the magnitude of this decision based on James Madison. Property, he says. This term, in its particular application, means, quote, that dominion which one man claims and exercises over the external things of the world in exclusion of every other individual." End quote. In its larger sense, he says, and juster meaning embraces everything to which a man may attach a value and have a right, and which leaves to every one else the like advantage. In the former sense, a man's land or merchandise or money is called his property. In the latter sense, a man has a property in his opinions and the free communication of them. He has a property of particular value in his religious opinions and in the profession and the practice dictated by them. He has a property very dear to him in the safety and liberty of his person. He has an equal property in the free use of his faculties and the free choice of the objects on which to employ them. In a word, a man is said to have a right to his property. He may equally be said to have a property in his rights. And he says, where an excess of power prevails, property of no sort is duly respected. No man is safe in his opinions, his persons, his faculties, or his possessions. Where there is an excess of liberty, the effect is the same, though from the opposite cause. He said, government is instituted to protect our property of every sort. Not just the physical property that we own, but the property in our rights. But now that we have allowed the federal government to own something they're not entitled to own, physical property, the ownership of this physical property will take away our ownership of our intellectual property, of our rights, in our freedom of religion, and our freedom of speech. It's happening right in front of our faces, right here in the Ninth Circus. Who will rule against the Knights of Columbus? I guarantee it. I will put on my soothsayer hat and make this prediction. It's not a difficult one. I'm not reaching out on a limb here. Government is instituted to protect property, not to own it and to take it. And it's not a just government where property of the individual is not secure and where the government can take the property from the people arbitrarily, creating restrictions. You see, creating restrictions is taking of property. If the government can tell you what you can and cannot do on that property through restrictions, you don't own that property. You lease that property, and there's the rub, isn't it? Because that's exactly what they're calling it. You don't own property. You can't buy land on federal land. They allow you to possess it as long as they give you permission. James Madison called that complete despotism. And meanwhile, Congress does nothing about the fact that they fund land they don't own. They don't constitutionally have the authority. It is an illegal possession of land. You find somewhere in the Constitution where it allows the federal government to own land for management, for national forests, there's not even a provision for national cemeteries in the Constitution. If the states want to establish cemeteries to honor their veterans, then that's what they're supposed to be doing. There is no provision for national cemeteries in the Constitution. No national land other than forts and ports and Washington, D.C. So what exactly is our Congress up to while we're distracted? Well, let's see. They passed an education bill on Wednesday of last week, which updated George W. Bush's No Child Left Behind. So now we own land, and now we have the federal government also owning education, because if they pay for something, then they own it. Go to a store and buy something and let the store owner believe that because you bought that from them, you know, they still own possession of it. No, you pay money for it, you own it. They own our education system because they've bought it. I suppose it's extortion, really. You either give us your money through taxes or we'll throw you in jail. And then you beg for the money that we've stolen from you under false pretenses. and you be happy with the way that we dictate to you how it's spent. This education bill was overwhelmingly voted for by the Republican House. I am very proud to say that Justin Amash and my representative, Ted Yoho, voted against this. I'm beginning to see a trend with my representative, Ted Yoho. I'm beginning to see maybe him finding some wisdom in the advice of his constituents. I'm very excited about that. I actually sent Ted Yoho a text message for the first time in a very, very long time, thanking him for voting against this bill. Because guess what? In 218 to 213 votes, the House, excuse me, the House voted in favor of this bill. It was the Democrats who were opposed. Now, it wasn't because they were opposed to the federal government spending. They were opposed because it was a George W. Bush thing, okay? So that's what it was. It was a whole, we're going to vote against George W. Bush, but we'll vote for Obama's, funding of education. We're not going to vote for George W. Bush. It was a whole partisan thing. Don't give the Democrats any credit for voting against this. It was nothing to do with keeping government out. But this is what the House of Representatives is doing. Funding education, and they have no constitutional authority to do so. What else is the House doing? Well, the House GOP is working to extend highway funding to the end of the year. This is not the job of the federal government. The federal government is not to be funding all of our roads, just post roads. What would that mean, post roads? Post roads are the roads, interestingly enough, that the post office would operate on. And I'm thinking this is part of the things that maybe the Famers didn't have full vision on. Post roads would be only the roads necessary to connect the states together to run the post offices. That's it. Not the extension of the Department of Transportation by which every road on the country, every bridge, every thoroughfare is funded by the federal government. And yet our House is busy trying to put together a 5-month package which would cost $8 billion. They're calling it fairly innocuous, boring stuff. The destruction of our Constitution by funding is not innocuous, and it should not be boring. It is the truth that when the federal government spends beyond their capacity, beyond their authority, it is the destruction of the Republic. It is destruction of our Constitution. Listen to what James Madison has to say about this. In 1792, James Madison warns of the consequences of interpreting the General Welfare Clause as a general boilerplate power rather than a description of the intent that the limited powers be to the general benefit of the entire Union. He said, if the General Welfare Clause really authorizes Congress to do whatever they think fit, provided it be for the general welfare, of which they are to judge, and money can be applied to it, Congress must have the power to create and support a judiciary establishment with a jurisdiction extending to all cases favorable in their opinion to the general welfare. In the same manner as they have the power to pass laws, apply money providing in any other way for the general welfare. Did you catch that? The expansion of our court system has been done so unconstitutionally because of the General Welfare Clause in spite of Madison's warnings. He continues and says, if Congress can employ money indefinitely to the general welfare and are the sole and supreme judges of the general welfare, they may take care of religion into their own hands. There you have federal lands There you have HHS. There you have IRS. And are the souls take religion into their own hands? They may appoint teachers in every state, county, and parish, and pay them out of their public treasury. They may take into their own hands the education of children, establishing in like manner schools. He's talking about curriculum throughout the Union. Madison warning us that the federal government has no business in education. They may assume provisions for the poor, and the federal government has no business in welfare. They may undertake the regulation of all roads rather than post roads. Regulation of those roads, not the funding of those roads. Are you kidding me? 1792, James Madison is telling us that the Department of Transportation is completely unconstitutional. And he says, be careful, because in short, everything from the highest object of state legislation down to the most minute object of police would be thrown under the power of Congress. For every object I have mentioned would admit the application of money and might be called, if Congress so pleased, provisions for the general welfare. And in 1792, James Madison warned us of the federal government that we have today. He said it would subvert the very foundations and transmute the very nature of limited government established by the people. Welcome to a transmuted America.
If you won't, or love me if you can. If the truth is what you want, then you found your man. I ain't backing down, I ain't backing up. If you think like I think, then crack it on up. I won't back up, I don't back down. I've been raised up to stand my ground. Take my job, but not my guns. Tax my check till I ain't got none, except for the good Lord up above. I answer to no one.
The KrisAnne Hall Show. She's Liberty's lobbyist.
Meanwhile, as the federal government owns land, controls land, they're going to control your property ownership. They're going to control your religious expression. They're going to tell people who own property or don't property. And the federal government is expanding their ownership of their land on a daily basis. Executive order after executive order after executive order, legalizing the Bureau of Land Management's land grab, expanding federal land management, reserving land for preservation. This is absolutely crazy. And it's been going on for decades. Every time the federal government expands their control over land, they expand their ownership. Meanwhile, Congress is being distracted over this flag issue. Oh my goodness. How are we so distracted over a Confederate flag? How is that even possible? That we now have amendments in Congress to remove these Confederate flags from federal land. Does that mean if you own a home on federal land, which you don't really own, and you want to fly a Confederate flag, that the federal government can now come and tell you can't fly a flag? What happens when the federal government starts eliminating other flags? Because the federal government that can eliminate a Confederate flag means that they can eliminate any flag. It's called elimination of free speech. Because if the federal government can take away one thing based on its content, then there's nothing sacred. It's not about a flag. They're not saying no flags can fly. They're saying this flag with these colors and this perceived content cannot be flown. what perceived content is next. And guess what? A federal government that can prohibit you from flying a flag based on its colors and perceived content can also mandate that you fly a flag as well. Is that where we want to go with this power? Because removing all forms of Confederate flags will not remove the hate from people's hearts. As a matter of fact, you're just creating larger division, and the only beneficiary of this division is government. They keep us divided and distracted so they can consume more power, government control over flags. We don't have enough government control. We've got government control over bakers. We've got government control. We're about to have government control over pastors. We already have that with the 501c3. We have government control now over flags and speech. This is not liberty, America. This is not. And this is a huge deal because we are completely unaware of the real consequences of these federal actions. You give them a centimeter and they will take 30,000 acres. That's where we are. It's about time we get a Congress that's devoted to real constitutional issues. We need a Madisonian Congress. We need some people who understand limited government. But you know what? We are not a reflection of our government. The government is a reflection of its people. And we need to be more constitutionally minded people. Stop begging for the federal government to solve our problems. Stop begging for the federal government to own land and fix our issues. It's time for us to step up like adults, pull up our big boy pants, start owning and maintaining on our property, and guarding that with our very lives. Saying the federal government, this is our property. You cannot arbitrarily seize it through ownership or regulation. It is ours. You don't have the right to own it. You cannot own it, and we will not allow you to. We have to stop being silent over these issues and start standing for liberty. Our children are depending on it. God bless. See you tomorrow.
Something down if you get in our way.